Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Kalik, and you're watching Dispatches on Breakthrough News. Venezuela, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Somalia, Yemen, Nigeria, an ever-growing list of countries that have faced the wrath of U.S. imperial power in recent months. But this isn't just another episode in the long history of U.S. interventionism, or even the thrashing of an empire in decline. What we're witnessing is something far more dangerous. Our guest today calls it the dawning age of impunity, a moment decades in the making, built through unprovoked wars, sanctions, coups, occupations, assassinations, mass civilian slaughter, and even the kidnapping of a sitting head of state, sustained by the complicity of allies and the complacency of global institutions meant to stop it. From Gaza to Venezuela, the U.S. is openly violating international law across continents. And they're telling us Iran is next. The message is clear. There are no longer any red lines. Joining me to make sense of it all is Craig Mokhiber, longtime international human rights lawyer, former senior UN human rights official, and author of the article we're going to be discussing, Ushering in the Age of Impunity, Venezuela, Palestine, and the End of International Law, published at Mondoweiss. Craig, welcome back to Dispatches.
Hi, Rania. Great to be with you again.
My God, we were just talking before we were recording that you asked me how I'm doing, and I said I'm exhausted, and it's only 13 days into 2026. And you said it's like every day a decade happens. And that really is what it feels like. And I mean, we have a lot to talk about here. I think a good place to start, you wrote this article, it's incredible, and it's good timing, not just because of what just happened in Venezuela, which we're going to talk about, but also we hear the drums of war beating louder and louder for Iran. I would not be surprised if today, tomorrow, this week, we see the U.S. Strike Iran. That's what Donald Trump is promising. And so, you're talking about this age of impunity that we're in, and that's what's making things get worse in terms of U.S. behavior around the world. And some people would say to you that we've seen this before, right? We watched it with Iraq. We watched it with Libya. We watched it with Syria, with Afghanistan. So I guess my first question for you is, what makes this moment different? Why isn't this just another chapter in U.S. imperial violence? What tells you that we've crossed into something qualitatively new?
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right, that that's not the essence of what is happening is not new. We have witnessed this kind of building crescendo of unconstrained violence, both domestically inside countries like the United States, and especially countries like the United States, but also internationally, right? We've got this 80-year experiment after World War II, where there was an effort to build this framework of international law that protected human rights, that protected peace, that protected economic and social progress, all of those lofty promises of the UN Charter and of the various treaties on human rights and so on. And what we've been witnessing really for decades now, and I agree that this is not something that was invented by the crazy Orange Emperor, but is something that has been building for decades, both domestically in the US and internationally. So domestically, you look at the war on drugs, and you see the excesses that became normalized of mass incarceration and racial profiling and really repressive policies based upon this boogeyman of drugs. And then on the heels of that, the war on terrorism, where we saw the normalization of kidnappings and renditions and summary executions and torture by U.S. forces and U.S. intelligence, and the normalization of that, and the fact that the U.S. got away with the war on drugs, that it got away with the war on terrorism, that there was no accountability, that it got away with this global and domestic economic project, which is the systematic, I've said, immiseration of the many in order to consolidate the wealth and power of the few. That is a 50-year project, at least, of the United States, for which they have never been held accountable, not legally, not politically. And that's where that's how impunity works. As I've said before, impunity is a strange kind of beast. The more you feed it, the hungrier it becomes. And the world has been feeding the empire's impunity decade after decade after decade. And now we have reached a world where the two cardinal rules of the post-war world, that there shall not be genocide and there shall not be aggression, have effectively been erased by the United States and, I have to say, by its Israeli partner. I refer to this as the US-Israel Axis. It is a joint project going back decades to dismantle any constraints of international law. And we see that now being accelerated, right? So, we've seen Israel just in the last 2 years perpetrate a live stream genocide, occupy the territory of 3 different countries, launch a transnational terrorism attack on Lebanon with booby-trapped pagers, attack humanitarian boats in the Mediterranean, bomb a half a dozen countries in acts of blatant aggression, carry out a campaign of assassinations all across Western Asia, and using its proxy organizations planted all across the West to persecute Americans and Brits and Swiss and Germans who are simply standing up to oppose the policies of this oppressive foreign regime of Israel, its genocide, its apartheid, its occupation, and so on. This is where all of the rules that were promised in the wake of the Second World War begin to be dismantled. And the fact that that Israeli project across the world has been wholly supported by the US, and now that it has come home, this is not the first ICE murder of Renee Good. There have been dozens who have been killed by this rogue outfit called ICE. And even this is not new. Ask migrants in the US going back for decades, ask African Americans, ask Indigenous Americans, ask Muslims, Muslim Americans, people of color, and people living in poverty in the US. For them, this is not new, but now it has become normalized. It has become the rule, and it is being exported to countries like Venezuela, where last week we reached a point where you actually had the US, bomb and invade a sovereign country, kidnap its president and first lady, spirit them back to the United States for a politicized trial. And every single act of that is a violation of international law. In fact, going back before that, the sanctions imposed unilaterally by the US on Venezuela are in violation of international law. And yet, nobody did anything to try to counter those sanctions. The CIA thuggery that's been going on inside Venezuela for many, many years, those are violations of the sovereignty of Venezuela. They are violations of international law. The summary executions of boaters in the Caribbean and in the Western Pacific, those are violations of international law. And obviously the bombing, the invasion, the kidnapping that has just taken place, those are violations of international law. So there are no more rules. We're living in an age of impunity in which even the most prohibited, most clearly prohibited acts, torture, summary executions, aggression, and genocide are now being normalized. And if this rampage by the US-Israel axis is allowed to proceed, there will be nothing left of international law or even of the vision of a world governed more by the rule of law and less by the use of force. And anyone who has seen the footage of Stephen Miller, who is the sort of fascist in chief inside the Trump administration, laying it out with great clarity in an interview with the genocidal Jake Tapper of all people, where he says, look, these international niceties are all very lovely, but the rule of the world is the rule of force. It's the rule of power, and the US intends to use it in any way that it sees fit.
It really is a very scary moment to watch. I want to go back to the issue of Venezuela because you did a really good job in your piece breaking down the various ways that you actually wrote the complex of international crimes perpetrated by the US and Venezuela is stunning in its scope. I'm curious if you can break down for our audience what makes the US actions against Venezuela so clearly unlawful under international law. And it might seem like super, self-evident, but I think it's important to hear that breakdown because it's kind of shocking just how illegal everything the US has done to Venezuela has been.
Yeah, and blatantly so. And, one of the amazing things, and you and I have discussed this before, Rania, is the way media corporations in the West have been reporting on this. as if it is just some kind of controversial law enforcement operation, instead of a cluster of blatant crimes under international law being perpetrated by the US. The criminality of these actions is not even mentioned in US corporate media coverage, or by the way, even by the so-called opposition Democratic Party politicians in the United States, whose only concern seems to be, well, you should have checked with us first before you launched a regime change against a sovereign country. This is a cluster of crimes. It cannot be called a law enforcement operation because it was a criminal operation. And in criminal operations, the perpetrators, those who order it, those who follow the unlawful orders, they're supposed to be held accountable under the rule of law. But this is such a massive cluster of crimes. As I said, the sanctions imposed on Venezuela by the US, these are unilateral coercive measures under international law. They are unlawful. They violate the UN Charter and a whole raft of international human rights treaties that are binding on the United States. Also unlawful were the US-supported coup attempts in 2002, in 2019, in 2020. All of those were violations of international law. Covert CIA operations in the country that have been going on forever. These are unlawful. These are violations of sovereignty. They're breaches of international law. And as if it has to be said out loud, the murder of boaters in the Caribbean, whether or not they're involved in drug trafficking, which clearly some of them at least were not, but even those that you say were involved in drug trafficking, by the way, to the Caribbean, not to the US and their small boats, that is unlawful. Those are extrajudicial execution under international human rights law. It's a grave violation of international law. The US blockade on Venezuela is unlawful, as has been repeatedly affirmed with these kinds of actions by the International Court of Justice. These are violations of international law. The really stunning arrogance of the US in pirating Venezuelan oil tankers, in stealing the resources, in ignoring the flagging of those ships, and of stating out loud in Trump's own voice that they intend to keep the ships and steal the oil. That is an act of maritime aggression under the UN Charter, under the law of the sea, and it's a violation also of legal principles of sovereign immunity. The bombing, the invasion, and by the way, the subsequent threats of further force, because the threat of the use of force is also a violation of the UN Charter. And the US has said repeatedly, if Venezuela doesn't do what we want, they're going to get more of this. And it has threatened other countries in the region and beyond, most notably recently Colombia, and of course Iran, where it's gearing up again to wage a bloody assault against the people of Iran. That's a violation of the Charter of the UN. The Charter is a treaty, and it is binding law on the United States, including in domestic law in the United States. And then obviously, flying in, murdering the guard, kidnapping the president and First Lady Celia Flores, these are violations of the Charter. They're violations of international human rights law, which prohibits arbitrary arrest and detention. And this is arbitrary arrest and detention. It violates an international legal principle called head of state immunity. Right? This is not, you cannot have a peaceful world order where everybody's flying around arresting each other's presidents, right? There are provisions in international tribunals like the International Criminal Court that would allow a head of state to be indicted and to be arrested, but you can't have individual countries arresting each other's leaders. It should be self-evident that this is not normal, but it's clearly not legal. And then you look at the violence that was used, right? We saw the images of Celia Flores, scarred and beaten and bruised and battered and with her ribs bandaged and her face bloodied. That violence, because it took place in an unlawful arrest, and because it was done so violently, those are individual violations of international law. They circulated photos of Maduro bound and blindfolded and earphoned and so on in a kind of global perp walk. That's a violation of international humanitarian law that prohibits precisely that kind of dissemination because it's an offense to the dignity of the prisoner. We saw in those images that they were intentionally imposing sensory deprivation with blindfolds and ear covers and so on. That also is unlawful under human rights and humanitarian law. And because his arrest, his abduction was unlawful, That means that they are committing further violations of international law with every day that they continue to hold him, because that's an act of arbitrary detention. And obviously, the US has no legal defense. So it is simply ignoring international law, saying we're doing this because we can do it, and then purporting to deal with this under US national law. Imagine a world where any country could legislate against the people or the politicians or the institutions of another country, and then claim that they're acting in a lawful way when they do it. This is a complex of crimes being perpetrated by the US government and by individuals within the US government who, according to international law, should be held accountable. Have you heard that from corporate media? I don't think so.
No, definitely not. I mean, the media has been completely insane, probably because they're, funded by all the same people or same organizations, same power bases that fund our politicians to support endless war. I really quickly I have this Stephen Miller clip that you mentioned. I think it's worth playing. I played it on several episodes over the last couple of weeks, but I think this clip is worth watching because it really sums up the doctrine of US empire right now.
The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become the supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us, to hoard weapons from our adversaries, to be able to be positioned as an asset against the United States rather than on behalf of the United States.
Sovereign countries should be able to do what they want to do.
The Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Doctrine is all about securing the national interests of America. For years, we sent our soldiers to die in deserts in the Middle East to try to build them parliaments, to try to build them democracies, to try to give them more oil, to try to give them more resources. The future of the free world, Jake, depends on America being able to assert ourselves and our interests without apology. This whole period that happened after World War II, where the West began apologizing and groveling and begging
I don't even
and
know,
engaging these
honestly,
vast
what you're talking about right
schemes,
now.
What I'm talking about, Jake, is the idea, and by the way, I know you love doing that smarmy thing, Jake, and I was hoping to be better than that this time.
I asked you about if there should be an election.
Exactly.
I asked you if there would be an election in Venezuela. That's what I asked. I said, why was the president so quick to dismiss Machado? You answered that question. And then I said,
the objective, Jake, is security and stability for the people of Venezuela.
I mean, first of all, if you've got Jake Tapper, who's such a hardcore imperialist, loves Zionism, if you've got even him going, bro, like, what are you saying? You're really off the deep end. But I mean, it's incredible. You've got this is the ethos of this administration, is they're saying we will bomb you if you sell oil to people we don't want you to sell oil to. And you have that same administration, like you mentioned, threatening other countries as well. They're threatening Iran as we speak. They've been threatening Mexico, Cuba, Colombia. I mean, it's just so insane. I'm just curious if you have anything else to say about that clip I just showed before I move on to a tangentially related topic.
Yeah, it always reminds me that, you shouldn't bully people in school, because I just have this idea that this Stephen Miller fellow was, because he's such a psychotic little creep, was probably bullied and is now taking his revenge on the entire world. He reminds me of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, I have to say, except if he wasn't such a dangerous. I think he really is kind of the fascist ideologue in the Trump administration who's directing a lot of this. And you hear him, I mean, this could be a statement from Germany in the 1930s. The same principles, the same values, the same arrogance, and the same complex of lies as well. I mean, it's not true that Venezuela refused to sell oil to the United States. It was selling oil to the United States. There were international oil companies still operating in Venezuela. Maduro's been trying to make a deal with the U.S. government for further oil exchanges and so on. And then the other half of that is that they don't have a right to do business with other countries. Well, who says so? I mean, they used to hide the U.S. empire. Now it's just out there, boldly. And that clip should be watched over and over again by people around the world, particularly people in governments in the West and beyond, in Western Asia and beyond, who have been on their knees in hopes of appeasing the empire and have allowed this impunity to mushroom with, atrocity, bigger and bigger atrocities successively being perpetrated by the US, and now the normalization of those atrocities, which, by the way, Jake Tapper shares, because he is the dean of normalizing genocide in the United States. He's never met an Israeli atrocity that he wasn't all in for. And now he acts surprised when the same lawlessness is perpetrated by the US government and stated so openly. I'm sure he's dying to pull Stephen Miller aside and give him some propaganda tips on how to hide your crimes. But he's not gonna need to do so because it's now all out in the open.
It really is. And I want to go to something you kind of touched on, which is the complicity and complacency of many actors around the world, because you don't just indict the US and your piece, you also point to the complicity specifically of allies in these vassal states, and then the complacency of others. Can you talk about the role played, I guess let's talk about domestically, by Congress, the courts, corporate media, and then maybe we can broaden out to sort of international bodies like the UN and ICC, and creating the environment for this sort of thing to continue to escalate?
Well, domestically, there's this long-standing problem of a very arrogant, nationalistic, chauvinistic view of international law by American institutions. And that absolutely includes the executive, which Democrat and Republican presidents going back forever in the history of the US have never behaved in ways that were particularly respectful of international law. But the Congress, that's supposed to be a check on power of the executive, as I've said, it has not even asserted arguments of legality or morality. What it has done for the most part is to say, and here I'm talking about the Democratic side of the Congress, the Republicans are all in for the most part. It has said, no, this is an act of war. You have to run it by us first. And do we have any doubt that the Congress, having had it run by them, would not have approved of these acts of aggression perpetrated by the US? This is the same Congress that has continued not just to fund genocide in Palestine, but to cheer it on and to give record numbers of standing ovations to the indicted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, who has stood before them like a hero, rather than like the disgusting criminal that he, in fact, is, despised by the entire world outside of Washington, D.C. That is not a principled approach to what the U.S. has done in Venezuela. A principled approach would demand accountability for the perpetrators and redress for the victims. That's a principled approach. It would demand the rule of law. It would demand respect for international human rights law, humanitarian law, the UN Charter, the law of the sea. That's not coming from the so-called opposition. So that is a completely dropped the ball. I think we will see, and it remains to be seen what happens in the so-called trial in New York of Maduro and his wife. But the reason that they're bringing this case in U.S. courts is because they know even U.S. courts are notoriously chauvinistic and very disdainful of international law. I pointed out in my piece that one of the things that struck me when I was studying law and later in my work as a lawyer is that U.S. courts, they routinely dismiss international law, and they refer to it often as foreign law. International law is not foreign law. It's not the law of the United Kingdom or the law of Botswana. It is domestic law according to the Constitution of the United States that says that it is the law of the land. It is law that is made with the participation of the U.S. government. It is not foreign law. It is international. It has to be respected. It has to be implemented. But U.S. courts are notoriously disdainful of international law, and usually, claims in international law don't get past the jurisdiction stage, where they say, well, this is a foreign policy matter. We have to leave it to the executive. If they want to behave like Nazi Germany, that's up to them. We have nothing to say about that. Internationally, of course, we've seen governments around the world. So in Latin America, half of the governments are now right-wing governments who see their power as deriving in large measure from the Trump administration, not just from the US government, from the Yankees to the north, but from the Trump administration in particular. And they have, not only not condemned this. Some of them have cheered it. You see European governments making the most equivocal statements, just shameful, obsequious statements from people like the British Prime Minister, who refused to condemn this or even to make a sort of substantive statement on what has occurred there. You saw the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's supposed to be the guardian of international norms and standards, make a statement, of some concern, but really not a very clear condemnation. This very usual hyper-cautious statement that we've grown so familiar with during the genocide in Palestine, where he seems to be afraid to offend the perpetrators, and therefore he abandons the victims in his statements, right? They bring it to the Security Council. Of course, the US has a veto in the Security Council, has two other allies with vetoes in the Security Council. So the Security Council is not going to be able to take action. So you get this very strange display where country after country condemns what the US did, but then they don't take any action. And by the way, sure, there's a veto in the Security Council, but those countries could step outside the Security Council and join together in a forceful condemnation and adopt some measures to try to counteract these crimes and violations of international law being perpetrated by the US. They will not do so, just as they will not challenge the genocide in Palestine or the other crimes of the Israeli regime. And now you see those same governments cheering on effectively the march to war against the Iranians, because that's how impunity functions. And then, as we said, U.S. media corporations cheerleading these crimes and even encouraging that they be taken further. That's the role of the corporations, which, of course, have a very important financial stake in war. Literally, they are intertwined. Their income, their value is intertwined with the perpetration of these crimes. Internationally and globally. How could that be? I put that question in my piece. The answer is that this is the age in which we're living. It's the age of impunity, where formal checks on abuses of power no longer function at the national or international law. Witness, the violations perpetrated by ICE across cities in the United States. No longer controlled by international institutions. And the only counterbalance that is left is the people themselves. And that's why you see that the empire, the US-Israel axis, the corporations that are complicit in their global crimes are working so hard to shut down the people. How are they doing that? They're doing that by criminalizing dissent across the West. They're doing that by arresting people, by having the police beat them brutally to make sure that they don't dissent. They're doing it by purchasing, social media companies like TikTok to make sure that the information can't flow as freely. Not to mention consolidation of their already, overwhelming support of media corporations like CBS. And so through that, silencing, the blocking of the truth and the persecution of dissidents in all of these countries, the final pillar, the final check on the abuse of power of the US-Israel axis, of the US empire, of its Western and, I have to say, Southern country complicity is being slowly shut down. And what comes after that, all we have to do is to look back to the model for all of this in Stephen Miller's head, which is 1930s in Europe and beyond.
Yeah, except now we're talking about a country, the US, an empire with over 1,000 military bases, nuclear weapons, just this massive control, surveillance, military apparatus that has never existed in human history in terms of an empire. Like, we've had empires, but none with this technological capacity. And then you've got people like Stephen Miller basically with their finger on the trigger. And he really is in charge. There's article after article noting that Stephen Miller is actually basically the shadow president at the moment. And the guy's a Nazi. Like, there's no other way to put it. And it's quite a frightening prospect to think that, because I think at the end of the day, you also have all these countries in the global South. Yes, and many of them are captured by US imperialism, but then others are just scared. And you look at Gaza, you look at what they're doing in Venezuela, you look at what they're doing to Iran, and it's like, why would you want to stand up to U.S. empire when the response to that is just all-encompassing brutality, from economic terrorism to the physical destruction of your country? I mean, and that's why what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I think the people in the United States are more important than ever, actually, because, you know, we still have some level of, I don't want to say we don't live in a democracy, but there's still some aspects to the U.S. that respond to the public. And so how the public reacts to all these things is of the utmost importance right now. I want to go back to the issue of Venezuela and even, you know, tangentially here, Iran, because, you know, we're told that Venezuela has to be destroyed because of drugs, because of democracy, human rights, you know, whatever you want to throw in there. Iran, they really go in hard on the human rights and democracy angle. You know, Palestine is all because of like security and terrorism. But, you know, after Gaza, I think fewer people are buying this script. And you write that the real drivers of U.S. aggression are mineral wealth, resistance to U.S. hegemony, and opposition to Israel's crimes. And I'm curious if you could just unpack that and maybe start with how Venezuela has violated these unofficial rules.
Well, Venezuela, since the Bolivarian revolution in the country, has violated all three of those rules. It has decided that it would use its oil wealth not to the benefit solely of foreign corporations, but in order to improve the living conditions of people in their own country. So this assertion, by the way, which is codified in international law, of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. The oil in Venezuela belongs to the Venezuelan people. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. That is a statement of international law, but it is one that does not fit in with the imperial designs of the U.S. in the age of impunity. Secondly, Venezuela, since Chavez, has refused to bow to U.S. hegemony in the region and beyond. And that is the second sin that gets you in the gun sights of the United States. And then thirdly, they have stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people and have opposed Israel's crimes in Palestine, including the genocide, very openly. And that is a guarantee of suffering the wrath of the U.S. Israel axis and of the U.S. empire. And if you look at those three factors, and you look at Iraq, and you look at Libya, and you look at Syria, right, one by one, who have been taken down by the empire with the complicity of the Israeli regime, you'll see that they match up perfectly. This has never been about drugs. Nobody believes that Maduro was taken because he's a drug trafficker. There's no evidence of that. There's a guy sitting on top of a country with massive oil and mineral resources he doesn't need, to sell drugs for resources. So nobody believes these fake charges, and they're always sometimes it's drugs, sometimes it's human rights. I mean, I spent my entire life in the international human rights movement. You're not going to hear me defend human rights violations perpetrated by anybody. But the notion that the US, which sits now as the largest violator of the human rights of people on the planet, violating human rights domestically with mass incarceration, with institutionalized racism, with persecution of ethnic minorities, the continued marginalization of the indigenous people, police tactics that are in direct violation of international standards for the use of force, the murder of dozens just by ICE alone, let alone the murder of so many by U.S. Police forces. The U.S. has no, and by the way, the enthusiastic underwriting of a genocide in Palestine. The U.S. has no standing to point its finger with regard to human rights in any country, and nobody is fooled into thinking that the U.S. gives a damn about human rights at home or abroad. That was pretty obvious under previous presidents, and if anyone had any doubt, the Trump administration has stripped away the phony veneer that once covered U.S. human rights violations at home and abroad. So nobody believes these justifications. And if we have to tip our hat to Trump and his fascist regime for anything, it's for his honesty and that of Stephen Miller, who say very directly, we want their oil. We'll play the game and we'll talk about drugs and so on, but just as quickly as they accused Venezuela leading the cartel of the sun. As soon as they get their hands on them, they say, well, of course that doesn't really exist, so we're dropping that charge. So yeah, it's all nonsense. They always look for these kinds of justifications. You even hear them using these claims with regard to Iran. Iran has plenty of problems, but so does the United States. And so, but I mean, this idea of Iran cracking down on protesters as being something that just takes the breath away from American politicians and officials is the most hilarious thing that I can imagine, in a country that for the past 2 years has been brutally beating and arresting and smearing and doxing and firing and suspending and deporting protesters simply for saying that genocide is bad. And now they are the moral authority on human rights. Get human rights out of your fucking mouth, I will say, to paraphrase a certain Hollywood actor, right?
No, but you're absolutely right. This point is really important because, every single time there's a push for Western intervention, we hear the same exact script. It's always democracy, human rights, tyranny, and it's delivered with this staggering moral arrogance that actually, like you said, leaves you breathless, because it's coming from governments that are responsible for mass violence, for torture, for sanctions, for coups, for literal genocide that's still ongoing in Gaza right now. And this isn't me saying that countries like Iran are perfect and democratic utopias. I'm not saying that at all. But at the end of the day, people in Iran have every right to criticize their government. Absolutely. But who on earth are Western powers with the amount of blood and brutality on their hands to posture as these moral arbiters of anything? And who are Westerners more generally? Who are they to spend their time condemning Iran when their countries are so rotten? You see all of these European officials, I think it was the German chancellor, was going off about Iran. And it's are you serious? You've still got a Nazi problem, dude. Yeah. And it's this moral inversion. It functions so well politically. I think continues to work quite well, sadly.
Unfortunately, there a lot of folks are ignorant of the realities that are happening outside their borders, and they can be sold a bill of goods which bears no resemblance to the truth. And we've all seen the videos over and over again of the absolute brutality of the German police in brutalizing and terrorizing citizens simply for wearing a keffiyeh or for opposing the genocide. I think the German government has to keep its mouth shut on any claims of human rights. Any country that is complicit in genocide, the way that the government of the US, the government of Germany, the government of the UK have been, has no right to raise human rights claims anywhere else, because they're perpetrating human rights violations at home and they're supporting human rights violations abroad. And the situation in Iran reminds me so much of the situation in the beginning of the conflict in Syria, where you had protesters take to the streets with legitimate grievances, exercising their human rights to free expression, free assembly, free information, free association, in order to decry, in the Iranian case, the crash of the currency, massive inflation, legitimate economic concerns, and then being joined by those on the street who have legitimate concerns about political reform and about human rights. I am all in solidarity with them. But what a coincidence that those protests, again, are being exploited by not just U.S. and Israeli intelligence who are there trying to, stir up violence and so on, but proxy groups that are prone to violence, that are, blowing things up, attacking police, and so on. And this is what reminds me of Syria. You had legitimate protests in the Arab Spring in Syria who were raising legitimate concerns, and because these foreign powers don't give a damn about the human rights of the people in Iran, don't give a damn about the human rights of the people in Syria, they intentionally turn those into violent actions that they hoped would lead to their own goals of regime change, sacrificing first the protesters because of the crackdowns and ultimately the country themselves. Name a country that has been the subject of Western interference for purposes of regime change where the situation has gotten better for human rights. Did human rights get better in Iraq? Did human rights get better in Libya? Did human rights get better in Syria? no, no, no. And they won't get better in Iran. You can support people protesting for legitimate expansion of their human rights while still condemning the human rights violations of imperial powers that are trying to destroy the country, turn it into a war-torn place, and ultimately to damn the Iranian people, the Syrian people, the Iraqi people, the Libyan people, to generations of the grossest violations of human rights that one could imagine. We need to be consistent.
Oh, absolutely. And it's even the Israelis are saying, I mean, I just want to show this is an article from the Jerusalem Post not too long ago. Basically, there it is. Mossad spurs Iran protests as agents with demonstrators in Farsi message. And you've got many, like you've got Haaretz did an article about the Mossad's involvement. And this is not to say people don't have legitimate grievances in Iran. They absolutely do, especially with the horrible economic situation. But what has caused that inflation in Iran? It's been American sanctions, unilateral coercive measures that, as you've mentioned, are actually illegal under international law. Because you have one country using its economic power to basically economically terrorize another country with no institutional backing on a global stage whatsoever. And now you've got Trump threatening tariffs on any country that buys Iranian oil. So now that's literally like if countries actually stop buying Iranian oil, and by countries I mean countries like India and China and these global South countries that kind of get around U.S. sanctions, Iran really would starve. Like what the U.S. has been doing to Iran is so disgusting, and that that doesn't mean people in Iran don't have a right to protest. They absolutely do. But could you imagine if, we've got, massive protests against ICE taking place? If like some country with a foreign agenda tried to hijack that to cause chaos in the streets of the US, how disgusted and horrified we would all be, because that's vile to do to a country. Stoking chaos like that in Iran is exactly what the US and the Israelis are doing. And at the end of the day, it makes it nearly impossible for Iranians to have any agency in their own country, because the U.S. just jumps in and tries to weaponize it for their own agenda. And, when we look at the kind of chaos and instability the U.S. loves to cause, you mentioned Syria. Look at what a disaster fell on Syria for years and is still ongoing now because of what the U.S. did there. Look at Libya, which, the U.S. collapsed that state, and you had open air slave markets. Iran is a country of 80 million people. And like you mentioned, many different ethnicities. And the U.S. has always tried to cause sectarian and ethnic infighting. It's always trying to collapse the state, and it would just be completely disastrous for the region, which is why you have even the Gulf states that don't like Iran are very concerned by what they're seeing right now. But, that's all to say, like exactly to what we're saying. Who are these Western officials to say a word? They have so much more blood on their hands. And, I wanted to ask you if you could just very quickly, because the U.S. is also making these claims about its legality when it comes to Iran, whether it's Iran has a ballistic missiles program, because we have to bomb it for that. We have to bomb it for having nuclear facilities. We have to bomb it for having partnerships in the region that we don't like and giving those partners weapons. We have to bomb Iran for not being a democracy. Does the U.S. have any legal standing for inflicting what it's inflicting on Iran?
I mean, I think the question answers itself. Of course not. Every country has a right to pursue a peaceful nuclear program. Countries have a right to arm themselves for their defense. Can you name a country in the world that needs a strong defense capability more than Iran? Under constant attack from the Israeli regime and the United States, under constant aggression from abroad. It is their right under international law to defend themselves and to prepare for their defense. There's no question about it. It's not up to the Israel-U.S. axis whether or not they arm themselves. Now, I want to also respond to what you said just now about Iran, because I think it's so important. The context that is left out of analysis in the West by corporate media and by politicians and others. You cannot claim human rights and democracy when the United States, are the country that overthrew the democratically elected government of the country, imposed a brutal dictatorial regime under the Shah, guilty of murder and torture and mass incarceration and a brutal regime for the benefit of outside actors against the Iranian people. And then when that brutal regime is overthrown by the people, start to impose sanctions in order to intentionally to deprive the people of everyday necessities in hopes that if the people suffer enough, they will overthrow their country and provide an opportunity to install a Western puppet. So you begin with the human rights violation, you then follow it up with gross violations of human rights through sanctions and so on. And then for decades, you use your intelligence agencies and proxies in the country to try to destabilize the country to make sure that it doesn't get on a firm footing. And then, as we're seeing now, you use your intelligence and your proxies to try to incite violence in the countries, hoping for a massive crackdown on protesters that will provide further justification for essentially the destruction of the country itself. You cannot do all of those direct violations of human rights as the United States against the Iranian people and then claim the mantle of human rights and the policies that you're adopting. And then this idea that you're going to bomb people into human rights is one of the most absurd ideas I have ever heard in my life. So neither their case is clearly has no legal standing whatsoever. It has no moral standing whatsoever, and it doesn't even stand on a pillar of logic. It is illogical. And yet that is the position of the US empire. Why? Because Stephen Miller says we're big, we're bad, and we can do what we want to do. And that's the only rule.
It's really unbelievable. It's really unbelievable. I wanted to ask you, this is a bit of a pivot from Iran, but you go into detail in your piece. I want to come back to Latin America. You explore Israel's role in helping the U.S. control Latin America and the stark contrast between how the Latin American left versus the Latin American right relate to Israel. And I'm curious if you could maybe walk us through that dynamic. And there actually is an Iran angle to this, because you also talk about where Iran fits into that geopolitical alignment, particularly with regard to Venezuela's oil.
Yeah. Well, you've got this huge Israel connection. When the vice president made her first statement after the U.S. aggression and the kidnapping of the president, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, said that the attack on the country had, quote, Zionist undertones. And people in the West looked at that and they said, "Oh, what does that mean? That's just some kind of crazy statement." She did not elaborate on that. But we know, people who have followed the region at all, that the Israeli regime has been supporting right-wing forces and destabilizing progressive governments in the region for decades, with Israeli weapons and equipment and surveillance technology, Israeli intelligence, Israeli training, influence of governments and countries around the region, with Israel proxy groups that have been a constant feature of Latin America. And remember, this is not just with regard to military, this is with regard to security forces, internal security forces in these countries that are being given technology and tactics that are notorious and brutal for their abusive use on Palestinians that have been condemned by the UN and by countries all around the world. They have been exporting this to Latin America, and by the way, to the United States. You will not be surprised to learn that ICE and DHS and law enforcement agencies across the U.S. are being trained and armed and fed the ideology of the Israeli regime in programs as well. Militarized tactics used in law enforcement that have been condemned because they're designed not for civilian protection, but for killing and maiming people, as you would in a military assault, for example. Murderous counterterrorism tactics, so-called. And when you hear that word counterterrorism, you should begin immediately to be concerned about human rights. Counterterrorism tactics, surveillance, brutal crowd control techniques, racial profiling, intelligence gathering, all of that is coming from these Israeli programs that are being used across the Americas, including in Latin America and in the US for decades now. Surveillance and data extraction technology from Israeli companies like Celebrite and Paragon to access people's personal data. And then to say that the Israeli regime has been exporting not just weapons and technology and tactics to countries across Latin America and to the US through its police agencies and ICE and so on. It's also been exporting this violent racist ideology, this right-wing view of law and order, Zionism, militarism, anti-human rights ideology, deeply anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian ideology, and an idea that says that the targets of law enforcement are the enemy. They are terrorists, and they're not entitled to any human rights. And by the way, these programs in the United States as well, these are being organized by Israel proxy organizations in our own country. In the US, they're organized by the Anti-Defamation League, JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the American Jewish Committee, the American Israel Education Foundation, of AIPAC, Birthright Israel. These are, many of these, they tried to pose as Jewish organizations. We know they are no longer Jewish organizations. They are Zionist organizations. They're Israel proxy groups. And they're the ones that are organizing these. And, DHS and ICE even have offices in Israel. And all of this is paid for by US tax dollars that goes into the pocket of these Israel proxy groups in order to corrupt law enforcement and intelligence and military in the US and across the hemisphere, across Latin America. And you can see Israeli regime leaders have been celebrating the attacks on Venezuela and the abduction of the Venezuelan president. Why are the leaders of Israel so happy that the US has done this to Venezuela on the other side of the world? Well, one, they've been expressing the hope that if the US is willing to do this in Venezuela, it'll be willing to do it next in Iran. And remember that since Chavez was elected and the Bolivarian Revolution began, almost 25 years ago, Venezuela has been asserting its independence, resisting US hegemony, using its oil for Venezuelans, and standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Also, Israel has a long history in Latin America of attacking progressive forces, supporting right-wing regimes, death squads, dictators, trying to seed conflict across across Latin America, because it is trying to build support and solidarity for its project in Palestine and in Western Asia by buttressing far-right regimes that are like-minded with it. So it has been involved in these kinds of activities in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Costa Rica, in the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and obviously in Venezuela. So if you talk to people in Latin America, where there are very strong anti-colonial instincts still in the country, that explains why a lot of Latin American governments of the left view the Israeli regime with such disgust. But it also explains why the far-right movements and leaders in the region declare their fanatical support for the Israeli regime, for the Zionist project, even during the genocide, justifying the genocide in Palestine. And right-wing governments and Venezuela's right-wing opposition, they have very openly praised the Israeli regime and have pledged, Maria Corina Machado has pledged, if she can get into power, even closer collaboration with the Israeli regime. So, this is all connected to Israel. There's another factor, of course, which is, Venezuela's opposition to the Israeli regime, while also holding the world's largest oil reserves, that is seen by the US-Israel axis as a potential obstacle to their plans for Iran. Because Iran's own oil capacities, but especially its effective control over the Straits of Hormuz, and therefore over energy markets, that makes control of Venezuelan oil especially attractive to the US-Israel axis as it's preparing to attack Iran, because they want to remove that lever of control. So, this is an old story. Venezuela is not the first. I fear they will not be the last to be targeted by the US-Israel axis. But I think it's clear that the Israeli connection has been at the root of a lot of this. Not that the US empire needs that kind of encouragement for its for its imperial arrogance in Latin America, but it explains why we've seen this expedited action now in advance of their saber rattling against Iran.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the U.S. and Israel are partners in crime. There's also a China element to this. You know, the U.S. Sees its backyard as very important. The Americas as important in their Cold War against China, trying to build new supply chains, as they mentioned in their national, security outline under Donald Trump. I want to read you a Truth Social post by Trump, and I promise I'm not subjecting you to that for no reason. But first, I want to remind people to make sure that they smash that like button, you guys. It helps boost us in the algorithm. If you're watching and you haven't already, please make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News. Hit the bell for notifications and make sure they're clicked on all so that you get a notification whenever we do live streams like this or post new content. So I just wanted to tell you, Craig, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions, save the names of your killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. MIGA, which is Make Iran Great Again. And then signed President Donald Trump. And I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, man, like, again, imagine with these anti-ICE protests, if like the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, like posted, dear American patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions. That would be seen as like an act of war, and would be seen as completely unacceptable. And it would be a kind of intervention that really would be unacceptable. And you would never see that happen because really only the U.S. meddles in that sort of belligerent style, but just completely insane. I wanted to ask you as we begin to wrap here, Craig, because, we've talked a lot about this age of impunity we're in. And I mentioned to you in the beginning, but I kind of wanted to reiterate this because I often hear this from people myself. And it's, again, that some people argue that, international law has always been this like selectively enforced mechanism that's been manipulated by the powerful and used, when it's advantageous to them and then ignored when it's inconvenient to them. So I wanted to ask you, in maybe a different way, why does it matter if the post-World War II legal order collapses entirely? Why should we care about that?
Well, we should care about it because international law is one tool of many in the struggle for justice. Anyone who thinks that the world is going to be saved by international law alone hasn't been paying attention or is incredibly naive. That's not the argument in favor of international law. But anyone who says that we should completely ignore what international law provides is making a similarly naive assessment. Martin Luther King Jr. said, I know the law cannot make another man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty good. And you look at lawyers who, the law has been notoriously used as a kind of buttress for the status quo, including for unjust status quo. It has notoriously been used cynically by governments to point the finger at other governments for reasons that have nothing to do with violations of international law. But it's also been used as a tool of social justice inside countries and globally. I was convinced to study law by people like Ralph Nader and Bill Kunstler in the United States, who viewed law as a weapon of social change and who had, some real victories that changed, that limited the ability of the government and powerful corporate forces to oppress people as a result of that use. And I think it'd be crazy to leave that alone. We just saw Ali Abu Nema, who just won a massive victory in Switzerland in the case where he was, dragged off the streets of Switzerland and thrown into a Swiss dungeon, simply because there were Israel proxies inside the Swiss government who didn't want him telling the truth in Switzerland about Israel's crimes in Palestine. He just won a massive case that results not just in accountability for the Swiss government, but a kind of accountability for the individual people in the government who were responsible for that human rights violation. He could have said, what's the point of it? I'll just denounce this, but I won't use the law to hold them accountable. But thank goodness that he did, because this creates a deterrent effect. At least a piece of deterrence that needs to be built and built and built and built because he chose to use it. Law, international law, national law, these are not panaceas, but they're a valuable weapon that we'd be foolish to leave on the field. Remember, because of the pursuit of law, we have won the legitimacy struggle, right? Israel is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are indicted for crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. The UN mechanisms have found it guilty of genocide. They found that it perpetrates apartheid, that its legitimacy, a big argument, a multi-trillion-dollar exercise to build up the idea of the legitimacy of the Israeli regime is crumbling because people are also using the law. Law alone is not enough. You need resistance, courageous resistance. You need solidarity. You need boycott, divestment, sanctions, direct action, even in an age of the criminalization of direct action. We need to educate each other. We need to counteract the poison of corporate media and get the truth out to people. Every one of these is essential. The demonstrations, the denormalization of impunity, the denormalization of colonialism, of imperialism, of fascism, of Zionism, of Nazism, of occupation, of genocide, of apartheid. We have to denormalize those, and the law is one tool in which that struggle can be brought forward. Don't wait for the law to save you, but don't leave it on the battlefield. We need every weapon that we possibly can use in this struggle because, it's reached existential proportions now. It has bled across borders. The imperial boomerang has come home to the U.S. What the Palestinian people have been suffering for 80 years is now been spread across Western Asia and then into our own cities in the global West. In an age where all of these old threats, imperialism and fascism and Zionism and racism, all of those things have been brought with us from the 20th century into the 21st century. They're now paired with massive technologies of surveillance, of suppression, of murder as well. So it is an existential struggle, and we need every weapon that we can possibly use in that struggle. And international law is one. Imperfect, inchoate, weakened, under threat, maybe on the verge of being erased. But we have to pick it up and we have to use it as one tool in the struggle.
And that's really, really well said. And Craig, before we go here, I want to remind people again, make sure you hit the like button. And also, you can help support us here at Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month. You can help support independent media because we don't have Larry Ellison funding us. And all that's to say, Craig, I want to thank you for joining me for the hour to break all this down. And I also very quickly want to encourage people to go and read the piece that you've been discussing. Here it is at Mondoweiss, Ushering in the Age of Impunity, Venezuela, Palestine, and the End of International Law. Your analysis is so important and unmatched. Do you have any last words for our audience before we say goodbye?
No, just thank you for doing this. I hope everybody will stay engaged and keep up the struggle. There is a strategy out there to try to exhaust us, but we cannot be exhausted. The stakes are too high. So whenever you feel tired, take a day off and the next day come back louder and stronger because we are all at risk here. And as I've said before, that the next knock at the door could be on your door if you don't stand up now. So I know people will do that. I'm so grateful for what you do, Ronnie, and everybody else who does independent media and getting the truth out in a world of lies. And thanks for involving me in the conversation. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to take your advice myself because, man, am I tired. But just going to get some rest and come back stronger because the empire doesn't rest. Craig, thank you so much again. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Ronnie.